All right, it's time to build tools for our agents. So, tool calling is going to be perhaps one of the more important sections that you're actually going to go over in this course. Tools are basically what make agents very practical, very useful. It allows agents to go out into the real world and take actions, right? This is the entire point of agents, right? Is you want them to actually have access to tools to do things, right? So we're going to go over how to build those tools, how you should think about it, how you can kind of go from building single tools to multi-tool agents, and getting kind of as crazy as you can possibly imagine. The nice thing about agents is that there are just so many possibilities. You can pretty much do anything that you can write the code for, and we're going to kind of teach you how to set all of that up. So the first thing I want to do before we jump into this first lesson here, which is we're going to be focusing on the function call lifecycle, which we're going to kind of use tools and function calling interchangeably. Function calling is most of the time how you're actually going to be building kind of the core of these tools. So that's going to be the focus of this section, is kind of mastering function calling and how to hook function calls and function call schemas up with kind of real world code that actually does stuff. So we actually just want to really quick make sure that you are up to speed on having the most recent code available. So we're sitting here back in the code base that we've been working with. We got this all set up already in the intro section that we use this in the memory section. So what you need to do is, hopefully, like I recommended you do at the start of this course, was I recommended that you use Git, because this is going to help make it really easy for you to get the most up-to-date code that we're going to be using throughout the course in each one of these lessons. So I'm actually, for probably the duration of this course, going to be doing this step at the start of each lesson, just to make sure that you have whatever our most recent code is. So what you want to do is you want to run git pull origin main. And if you set this up with our GitHub repository, and you'll see mine's already up to date because I've already ran this step, is this should pull any updated code that we may have pushed since the last time you ran this. So particularly if you're coming from the memory section to the tools section, if you pull or from you're on git pull origin main, this is going to add a new tools section. Okay, so this is going to add an update to your code, and you want to make sure that you do this for each lesson, just in case that we've added an update to the course and things like that. Obviously, we're going to try and keep all the concepts that you see in the agents course updated to whatever's the latest and greatest stuff. So anytime you're watching a lesson, right, we may have had multiple versions of that lesson. So we want to make sure you get in the habit of pulling the code. Okay. And if you're one of those people who, instead of using Git, actually downloaded the zip file, you may just kind of need to go back to that repo and actually download the latest code, which, again, that's a totally valid way to do things. It's just doing the Git stuff is easier because it kind of takes care of the updates for you automatically, right? Just with this one line. So that's a super easy way to work. And again, we'll have all of the relevant links below for the lesson so that you can follow along with those relevant files too, to make that easy for you. But just kind of a minor note before we kick off this entire section, that's one of the things that you need to worry about to make sure that you have the latest code, right? Because if you don't have the latest code, you're going to get lost because you're not going to be able to kind of follow one for one what exactly we're doing here. So just want to make sure kind of prep there and set up correctly for success. So let's jump back into the function calling life cycle. So again, we're going to be using function calling sort of interchangeably with tools. So we will kind of go over function calling, which is like 90% plus, probably even closer to like 95% of what most people currently are using to build tools. There are some other techniques that you can use, like JSON schemas, forcing outputs with JSON schemas, and things like XML parsing, which is something that I personally really like. We'll probably save that until we actually get into less of kind of the conceptual things that we're going to be doing in the initial sections for the course, and kind of when we get to more project-based stuff and actually really start building complex agents. We'll probably address that then, so I don't want you to worry about that. Right now, you just need to know that if you master function calling, you're going to be really well set up to build tools for your agents, okay? So let's actually go through the process here, which is typically about a 5-step process, depending on how you want to count the steps here. This is kind of how OpenAI describes it in their docs. So one of the things that I recommend that you do, which is, I think, a super, super good use of your time here, and I think that they have one of the best guides written, and of course it happens to integrate really well with how their API works, is reading OpenAI's guide to function calling. So I do recommend that you pause this video and give this page a look, Obviously, feel free to skim. You don't necessarily have to read the entire thing here. If you do read one thing, I do recommend that you check out the life cycle of a function call, which is going to kind of go through the 5 steps that we're going to be covering in this lesson. They do a pretty in-depth example here that we'll probably be referring to over the course of this video. It has like kind of a delivery function, which I think is a really good example here. But this kind of mirrors what I think is kind of the best practices. And obviously, if OpenAI is recommending it, it's going to integrate well with their API. It's going to make your life really easy. So definitely give this a look here. This is a really nice reference guide. Maybe check back from time to time. They sometimes update this with new and improved information as they kind of release new models and things like that. So this is one of the best resources out there for function calling. That being said, let me jump into this little Figma diagram I have here so that we can go through each one of these steps. So we're going to kind of go through each one of these. We'll go through all of them at once, and then we'll kind of go kind of individually step by step. So the first thing that you're typically going to want to do when you add a new tool for your agent is you're actually going to want to identify some sort of code, whether that exists or it's code that you need to write, that's actually going to do something practical, right? So like a really basic example of this is, say you want to have a function call for doing like really basic math, right? Like let's say you have a function that's like add 2 numbers, right? Well, if the agent is going to add 2 numbers and you're going to pass it some sort of function call schema that's going to do that, what you actually want to do is you want to be able to pass whatever the result is that comes back from the LLM into some actual real working code. So if you're familiar with like ChatGPT's code interpreter, for example, one of the things that OpenAI does under the hood, right, is they basically have a code interpreter function where the LLM actually generates a bunch of code. And what OpenAI does is they take the code that the LLM generates and they pass it to an actual kind of Python environment, and then they actually run the code. That's basically a function call. Okay, so to take an example here that OpenAI uses here, again, this is why I think they've done a really great job with this guide, is if you look at their step 1, which corresponds with the step 1 that we're describing here, is that you can see that they say pick a function in your code base the model should be able to call. But in this case, they give this example of this get delivery date function. And this function takes in one argument, which is the order ID, okay? So the reason that a function call makes sense in the context of this example is that in order to get the LLM the information required to provide a useful answer to the user's query in this situation, is that the LLM needs to be able to go off and query whatever the get delivery date, which, you know, it looks like in this example, OpenAI is kind of mocking like some sort of a fake database, right? And so the idea is the LLM would get the order ID, right? So say I'm, you know, a user, I'm talking into my AI chat app and I'm like, hey, can you get the delivery date for like order 7, right? That 7 gets passed into get delivery date. We get some sort of result, you know, say it's, okay, this was delivered on October 1st of 2024. That gets passed back to the LLM, the result of that function, right? And then the LLM can actually answer. So the point of this is some sort of kind of data retrieval mechanism. And the reason we need a function call is we need to be able to get a specific variable here to pass into an actual code base, into an actual function from our code base, rather, get a result from that and then give it to the LLM, right? So that's kind of step 1, is you want to identify some place in your code that you actually need to call a function, right? So again, getting data fetching is really useful, right? So to take like a customer support agent, which will be one of the things that we actually look at in a future section for, or a future lesson of this section, is, right, you need to get customer information, right? Maybe you want to update that customer information, right? And all of those different functions actually correspond to actions that your code can take and your LLM can kind of determine based on the user queries what it needs to do, right? So how do you actually define what the arguments are that need to get passed into these functions that exist in your code base, right? And that is where the function calling schema comes in, okay? So function call and function calling schema are kind of the same terms. This is just referring to the format that we're actually using to define what a function call is, right? So to take this delivery date function, for example here, you can see that the schema, right, and this is what's actually getting passed to the model in the API, right? The model's getting some list of tools, whether it's one or it's a dozen, right? and it's going, okay, I have access to all of these tools based on the user query. Let me use the information that I can see here to determine which one of these functions I actually need to call. So in this case, let's assume we say, hey, I need the order information for order 7, right? I need that delivery date. So what the function or what the LLM is going to do is it's going to say, okay, I have access to this delivery date function, which is defined here. It looks like based on the description, this is what it does, right? Which is kind of how the model is actually determining what to call. And what we're doing with this parameters area here is we're defining, okay, this is the properties that we are able to kind of generate. So you can see order ID being the single parameter here that's required. We're going to be in the next lesson kind of going over the schema of this. So we're going to kind of gloss over the details here. But the point is that this is kind of the format of information that you pass to the model that actually allows it to generate the correct information that you need to be able to call this code. That's kind of the entire process of function calling, right? And so step 3 is actually passing that schema, or typically if you have an AI agent, typically you have a variety of function calls, different function calling schemas that you're passing, right? If you're kind of paying attention and you've come across or you've come from our memory section, right, in the long-term SQL file, you'll notice that before even really going over function calling and building tools for agents, we were actually kind of using this without really being too explicit about it. But what we were doing here with those memory tools, right, is we were basically saying, hey, here are the tools you have access to. It was save memory and get memory, right? And we define those schemas. And then if we go down here to where we make the LLM call, right, we're passing those tools to the tools parameter for the OpenAI chat completions API, right? So that's kind of how steps 1 through 3 are getting generated here, right? It's you're identifying where in the code do I actually want to have this function call actually run, right, and do actually real world things. What's the schema that I need to write to define kind of the behaviors and the parameters that I'm going to need, and I'm going to need the LLM to generate to pass into my function. And then you actually need to make sure that you actually pass those function call schemas to the LLM in the form of that tools parameter, right? So that's kind of steps 1 through 3 here. You can see in step 3 on the OpenAI guide, right? They're basically saying pass your function definitions as available tools. Worth noting that function definitions and function schemas and function calls, again, those can all be kind of used interchangeably, so don't let the terminology and all that jargon confuse you. They're all the same thing, right? It's just defining the schemas and it's trying to pass those as tools, okay? And then what happens on a practical side, right, is you're actually making a call to the LLM with some sort of query, and it's able to kind of go execute that function call, give you a result back. You're able to take that result, pass it to your actual code, get a result back from the code, and they get one more message. Okay, so we have been doing that here with the long-term SQL, with kind of that memory and showing you how to keep track of receiving and setting memories with an actual real working database, right? Which is what we did in the memory section. You can see OpenAI is doing the same thing here with this delivery example, right? You can see they have a little bit of a mock conversation. You can see there's a system prompt defining that, hey, you're a customer support assistant. And then the user's first message is saying, hey, can you get me the delivery date for my order? The model does not call this function, right? Because the model does not yet have a delivery date. But because you've passed that function schema to the model, it's at least smart enough to know, okay, I do in fact have access to this function, but I don't have the required parameter I need. So what you see the model does is the model intelligently asks back, okay, I can help with that, but I need an order ID, right? And again, it knows that because in the parameter definition here, we're requiring order ID. And then the user's coming back with, okay, I think it's order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So at this point, the model goes, awesome. I have the function I need. I have the information from the user that I need to actually pass to this function. That means I can actually go ahead and make the function call. So you can see if the model generates a function call, okay, which in this case it's successfully doing because now it at this point has the function name it needs and it has the actual order number that it needs to pass in as an argument to that function. It's able to go call that. And so what's happening on the model side of things is the model is looking at the schema here. It's looking at, okay, what do I actually need for this function? It's getting the order ID and it's recognizing, okay, here's the argument. What you're doing is you're then parsing the arguments here. And this is just a fancy term for basically saying you're extracting the arguments back from the function call, right? So in the case of our memory here, the argument, if we use the save memory function that we actually give if we use this as an example, right, the required parameter in this case is going to be the content, right? And in this case, this is whatever text is being actually saved as a memory. So what we're doing down here, as you can see, we're saying if the function call is save memory, what we're actually doing is we're doing the same thing that OpenAI does, right? Which is that we're extracting the arguments, okay? Parsing, extracting, kind of similar terms. Technically not the same thing, but we'll skip over that for now. But we're just grabbing that argument and then we're actually using that in our code, right? And the way that this happens in the OpenAI example with the delivery, right, is that this order then gets passed into that function that was written very at the top here. Okay, so that order ID is getting passed as a string. Theoretically, this is fetching some sort of delivery date, passing it back, and then you're passing that information to the model, and the model is able to draft up this final response here and actually give you the answer, okay? So, these are kind of two separate examples. All of this is probably going to be a little bit fuzzy. Okay, so you can see step 4 is grab the LLM response, as I just said, and then you're actually providing the function call to the function code. Okay, so we just kind of went over steps 4 and 5 there. And sometimes the model is going to want to respond back to you, and sometimes it's not. That's kind of up to you to decide how you actually want to build your agent. If it's something more conversational, which is kind of what we've been doing up to this point in the course, you're probably going to want a response back just because that's kind of good UX. But if you just have like an internal tool or something, you just want it to go take action and then not get back to you, that's totally fine too. It just depends on how you want to build these things, which again, we're going to get into a bunch of actual practical examples of this stuff. But that's kind of the life cycle of function calling. The basic idea is that you have something in your code that you want your agent to be able to access. You want it to do some sort of retrieval. You want it to go take some sort of an action, things like that. The way that you do that is you define a bunch of function calls that the LLM has the ability to call based on having those schema definitions get injected into its prompt, so to speak. Okay, it then grabs the function call based on whatever the user query is, right? So if I say hello, it's going to go, okay, I don't need to grab a delivery. But if I say, hey, I need the delivery date for order 7, for order 11, right? It's going to be able to go actually query that function call, grab that information, and then we're going to go through this whole process of running our code with whatever the arguments the function call gave us back. And then depending on whether or not we want to give a response back to the user, we could use that information or not, okay? So that is the function calling lifecycle. Again, it's going to be confusing at the start here because we just haven't really, we need to dive into some practical examples for all of this to click. But I do recommend going through this guide, even if you actually write the code yourself that OpenAI has here for you. That's going to be helpful. I do think we're going to go over some of the function call schema details here in the next lesson, and then we're going to get to a get weather example. I think that get weather example is going to really help this click because we're actually going to go in our code and get things running and tweak a few different things so that you can see how this entire thing works. So if you feel a little bit lost right now, don't worry, don't stress. That's totally normal. Function calling is pretty advanced concept. So if you're getting this far and you're actually putting the effort in, that's good news. Okay, we're going to work our way up from single functions to multi-tool agents. So by the end of this, you'll feel really comfortable with all this stuff. But that's the life cycle. Let's actually dive into some of the more details here on how you can actually build these function calling schemas and some tricks that you can use to help you with that.